Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I am back with our search for tyranny. We are beginning section 3 of the Heritage Foundation's Mandate for Leadership, Project 2025. We are reading it aloud to see what is actually contained within the paperwork because there is a whole lot of hyperbole. People are saying that this is the end of our democracy. Unfortunately, we have a republic, so that is not that great of a threat. We are going to dive in and we are going to check out the general welfare. If you were unaware of any of this, if you were interested in other parts of this, the link is down below for the original material, and what I am doing is linked in the corner and also down below. Let's dive into section 3, the general welfare. When our founders wrote in the Constitution that the federal government would promote the general welfare, they could not have fathomed a massive bureaucracy that would someday spend $3 trillion in a single year. Roughly the sum, combined, spent by the departments covered in this section in 2022. Approximately half of that colossal sum was spent by the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, alone. The belly of the massive behemoth that is the modern administrative state. HHS is home to Medicare and Medicaid, the principal drivers of our $31 trillion national debt. When Congress passed and President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law these programs, they were set on autopilot with no plan for how to pay for them. The first year the Medicare spending was visible on the books was 1967. From that point on, through 2020, according to the American Main Street Initiative's analysis of official federal tallies, Medicare and Medicaid combined cost $17.8 trillion, while our combined federal deficits over that same span were $17.9 trillion. In essence, our deficit problem is a Medicare and Medicaid problem. That is dumb. HHS is also home to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institutes of Health, CDC and NIH, the duo most responsible, along with President Joe Biden, for the irrational, destructive, un-American mask and vaccine mandates that were imposed upon ostensibly free people during the pandemic. All along, it was clear from randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of medical research, that masks provided little to no benefit in preventing the spread of viruses and might even be counterproductive. Yet the CDC ignored these high-quality RCTs, cherry-picked from politically malleable observational studies, and declared that everyone except children and infants below the age of 2 should don masks. Under the pandemic, as former director of HHS's Office of Civil Rights, Roger Severino, writes into Chapter 14, the CDC exposed itself as perhaps the most incompetent and arrogant agency in the federal government. Nor is the CDC the only villain in this play. Severino writes of the National Institute of Health. Despite its popular image as a benign science agency, NIH was responsible for paying for research in aborted baby parts, human-animal chimera experiments, in which genes of human and animals are mixed, and gain-of-function viral research that may have been responsible for COVID-19. Severino writes that Anthony Fauci's division of the NIH, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, owns half the patent for the Moderna vaccine, and several NIH employees receive up to $150,000 annually from the sales. They would be the same experimental that the CDC now wants to force on children who are at little to no risk from the thing, but at great risk from public health officials. This is going to be extremely difficult because it is still against the rules to say some of these things online. This is not my opinion. I am merely reading as the information states. I cannot stress that enough. I may get a strike for this, even with trying to gloss over some of the phrasing, because the algorithm is a real thing and it is still very much propagandized out there. The incestuous relationship between NIH, CDC, and the vaccine makers, with all of the conflict of interest it entails, cannot be allowed to continue, and the revolving door between them must be locked. As Severino writes, funding for the scientific research should not be controlled by a small group of highly paid and unaccountable insiders at the NIH. many of whom stay in power for decades. The NIH monopoly on directing research should be broken. What's more, NIH has long been at the forefront in pushing junk gender science. The next HHS secretary should immediately put an end to the department's foray into woke transgender activism. HHS also pushes abortion as a form of health care, skirting and sometimes blatantly defying the Hyde Amendment in the process. Severino writes that the FDA should reverse its approval of chemical abortion drugs because the politicized approval process was illegal from the start. In addition, HHS programs often violate the spirit and sometimes the letter of conscience protection laws. Severino writes that the HHS secretary should pursue a robust agenda to protect the fundamental right to life, protect conscious rights, and uphold bodily integrity rooted in biological realities, not ideology. The next secretary should also reverse Biden administration focus on LGBTQ plus equity, subsidizing single motherhood, disincentivizing work, and penalizing marriage, replacing such policies with those encouraging marriage, work, motherhood, and fatherhood, and nuclear families. If there is another department that has gone off the rails like HHS during the Obama and Biden administrations, it is the once proud Department of Justice, DOJ, as former counselor to the Attorney General Gene Hamilton writes in Chapter 17. The department has a long and noble history. Edmund Randolph, the first Attorney General, took office the same year as President Washington, yet its long-standing reputation has been marred by the Biden administration's abuse of the department's powers for its own ends. Hamilton writes that the department's unprecedented politicization and weaponization under the Biden Attorney General Merrick Garland, resulting in politically motivated and viewpoint-based prosecutions of political enemies and indifference to the crimes of political allies, has made the department a threat to the Republic. The most important thing for the next Attorney General to do is to refocus the department on its core functions of protecting public safety and defending the rule of law, while restoring its values of independence, impartiality, honesty, integrity, respect, and excellence. This is especially true of the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, a bloated, arrogant, increasingly lawless organization, especially at the top. The FBI views itself as an independent agency that is on par with the Attorney General, rather than as an agency that is under the AG and fully accountable to him or her. To rein in this completely out-of-control bureau and remind it of its place within, rather than at the top of, the DOJ hierarchy, Hamilton writes that the FBI's separate Office of General Counsel, with approximately 300 attorneys, separate Office of Legislative Affairs, and separate Office of Public Affairs should all be abolished. Requiring the FBI to get its legal advice from the wider department would serve as a crucial check on an agency that has recently pushed past legal boundary after legal boundary. Indeed, Hamilton writes, the next conservative administration should eliminate any offices within the FBI that it has the power to eliminate without any action from Congress. Elsewhere, DOJ should target violent and career criminals, not parents. Work to dismantle criminal organizations, partly by rigorously prosecuting interstate drug activity, and restart the Trump administration's China initiative to address Chinese espionage and theft of trade secrets, which the Biden administration terminated largely out of a concern for poor optics. This should also enforce existing federal law that prohibits mailing abortifacients rather than harassing pro-life demonstrators. Respect the constitutional guarantee of the freedom of speech rather than trying to police speech on the internet, and enforce federal immigration laws rather than pretending there is no border. In contrast to the DOJ's long history, the Department of Education, the Department, or ED, discussed by Lindsey Burke in Chapter 11, is a creation of the Jimmy Carter administration. The department is a convenient one-stop shop for the woke education cartel, which, as the pandemic era showed, is not particularly concerned with children's education. Schools should be responsive to parents rather than to leftist advocates intent on indoctrination. And the more federal government is involved in education, the less responsive to parents the public schools will be. This department is an example of federal intrusion into a traditionally state and local realm. For the sake of American children, Congress should shutter it and return control of education to the states. Short of this, the Secretary of Education should insist that the department serve parents and American ideals, not advocates whose message is that children can choose their own sex, that America is systemically racist, that math itself is racist, and that Martin Luther King Jr.'s idea of a colorblind society should be rejected in favor of reinstating a color-conscious society. The next head of this department will have a lot to do, hopefully culminating in the department's closure and salutary restoration of educational control to states, localities, and parents. The next Secretary of Energy will similarly have much work to do. Under the next president, the Department of Energy should end the Biden administration's unprovoked war on fossil fuels, restore America's energy independence, oppose eyesore windmills built at taxpayer expense, and respect the right of Americans to buy and drive cars of their own choosing, rather than trying to force them into electric vehicles and eventually out of the driver's seat altogether in favor of self-driving robots. As former commissioner of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Bernard L. McNamee says in Chapter 12, a conservative president must be committed to unleashing all of America's energy resources and making the energy economy serve the American people, not special interests. In Chapter 10, Darren Bast writes that the Biden administration's Department of Agriculture claims to be transforming the food system as we know it. But the government does not need to transform the food system. Instead, it should respect American farmers, truckers, and families. In Chapter 13, former Chief of Staff at the Environmental Protection Agency, Mandy Gunaskara, writes that the EPA's current activities and staffing levels far exceed its congressional mandates and purpose. Whereas its initial success in its infancy in the 70s was a product of clear mandates, a streamlined structure, and recognition of the state's prominent role. Having since become a coercive agency full of embedded activities, its structure and mission should be greatly circumscribed. Former Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Dr. Benjamin S. Carson, writes in Chapter 15 that HUD is beset with mission creep and regularly crosses the line into exercising quasi-legislative powers. Not anymore. In the next administration, it should focus on its core duties and keep non-citizens from living in federally assisted housing, to provide enhanced oversight of foreign ownership of U.S. real estate, and reinvigorate paths to upward economic mobility and economic self-sufficiency. In Chapter 18, former Acting Assistant Secretary of Policy at the Department of Labor, Jonathan Berry, writes that the department and related agencies should pursue pro-family, pro-worker policies to help restore the family-supporting job as the centerpiece of the American economy, in lieu of the current administration's left-wing social engineering agenda, the most assertive in history, which empowers race, gender, and climate change activists at the expense of American workers. In Chapter 19, on the Department of Transportation, DOT, former DOT Deputy Assistant Director for Research and Technology, Diana Furchtgott-Roth, writes, in pursuit of an anti-fossil fuel climate agenda never approved by Congress, the Biden administration has raised fuel economy requirements to levels that cannot realistically be met by most gas-powered cars, thereby reducing Americans' freedom while increasing costs. Lastly, former Acting Chief of Staff at the Department of Veteran Affairs, Brooks D. Tucker, echoing concerns expressed in other chapters, writes in Chapter 20 that the Veterans Affairs, VA, must be accountable to the needs and problems of veterans, not subservient to the parochial preferences of the bureaucracy. And so, we end the foreword, and I'm probably going to wrap this up and make it a self-segment. I was thinking I was going to go ahead into the Department of Agriculture, but it's going to get really long if we do that, and because that's like 20 pages, so that's close to an hour and a half by itself. There's not a whole lot for me to add to this. There will be as we go along. Some of these things, like Really, this whole section, I probably shouldn't even do a video on. It is reiterating things that will be covered later on, and we will cover them and talk about them more in depth as we go along. But I'm trying to include everything, but I can't. Like if I say the C word, that's something that's going to trigger things, and I tried not to. Right, the words are up here so that you can see it. The link is down below so that you can go back and read it. But there are things that we still cannot say in this country, and that is a terrible thing, but it is a true thing. They have relaxed some of the restrictions, so some of the things that were read on here would have absolutely gotten a strike a year ago, will probably pass by this time, but it is an ever changing landscape, and hopefully this isn't the video that gets me taken down, but it could very well be. There is a narrative. You are meant to not deviate from it. You can deviate. I deviate, but it is a personal choice that you have to make. Hopefully, I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a not too difficult little section here, right? This is stating what is going to be said more than anything, and so we're going to reserve a whole lot until it is actually said. If you like what I'm doing here, let me know down below. Hit me with a like, share, and a sub. Throw me a comment. Let me know that you like what we're doing. If you agree with me, let me know. If you don't, let me know. Comments is where it's at. As long as you keep it respectful, I won't block you. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.